All right, we have more changes unfolding in the perception of U.S.-Russia relations. Changes that have the fallout from Tucker Carlson's Putin interview continuing to ripple around the globe, leaving Western media forced to cover the story, trying their hardest to maintain this pre-established narrative about the Ukraine war and Russia being the invader and this expansionist power, a threat to liberal democracy. Now, there were a number of important topics that they covered in the interview, a number of items that I'd personally like to talk about, but I don't want this video to be super long. Instead, I'm going to focus on two things, two items that I believe are incredibly important. Also, I feel have barely been mentioned in the commentary since the interview dropped and are especially important for Americans to hear and understand. One of which is something I've long wondered about, speculated about, and I think has now been confirmed or at least answered from the part of Putin in this interview. But before we get started, thank you for liking and sharing these videos. It really helps me out. And make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these regular updates. Also, don't forget to check out our new daily show over on the Notify America YouTube channel. The link's in the description. So there's a ton of topics that they covered in this interview, but two items stand out to me. Two things that I don't think most Americans are even aware of. We're going to play both the clips, and I'll save the real important one for second. But the first exchange that I found most interesting was getting an answer to the question of why. Why is America's foreign policy so Russia-oriented? Why is Washington so anti-Russia, anti-Putin? Everything comes back to Russia, weakening Russia, especially over the last 8 years. Turn on corporate media and everything's about Russia, Russia's fault. And not just the US, but also in Europe as well. The cumulative West's foreign policy is all about defending itself against Russia. Even though the Soviet Union fell over 30 years ago, and, from time to time, you'll hear politicians slip up and admit that Russia isn't really a threat. We heard Barack Obama say this himself when he debated Mitt Romney back in 2012, and it's true. They aren't even in the top 10 largest economies. I think they're 11th. Brazil has a larger GDP than Russia does, yet our foreign policy is always aimed toward weakening them, picking on Russia above anyone else. Even the Ukraine-Russia war, at this point, most honest people know the real purpose of this isn't defending democracy, but instead it's to weaken Russia. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, testified about this in front of Congress, saying the goal is to keep Russia occupied and weigh them down, weaken them as much as possible, something that we've now spent over $100 billion of U.S. taxpayer money on, by the way. We're paying for that war. We're paying Ukraine's bills, folks. We're literally keeping the lights on over there, paying their pension plans for their government, all in the goal to do what? Weaken Russia. Now, in the interview, Putin refers to this as pressure. He says pressure, pressure, pressure. Everything you guys do is a policy of pressure. So why? What is so damn important about Russia that we have to devote all of this money, this energy, anti-Russian messaging and propaganda really for? Well, for a while, I've wondered about this, especially during the last administration, and the only thing that really made sense to me was if all of this isn't even about Russia, if the State Department's goal and our intel agency's goal with all of this is actually to curtail China, which in my mind, was the only logical reason to be doing all of this. Think about it. Russia borders China, right? They have a massive border with China, and in the inevitable future fight with China that's coming, Russia plays a vital role. Our military and intel agencies, they game this type of thing out constantly. Well, what if they gamed it out? And without Russia being on our side, we lose. What if there's no way to defeat China without Russia? But if we were able to flip Russia into being on our side, become part of the cumulative West, then the future battle with China becomes winnable. Now, if that is in fact what's happening here, then the goal would then become to do whatever you need to turn Russia into a Ukraine-like state, right? For example, where Ukraine is now clearly a U.S. proxy, they do whatever we tell them, turn Russia somehow pro-Western. I don't know all the details. Obviously, I'm not in CIA. That's just where my thought process went with all of this. It was the only logical thing that made sense, that answered the question of why are we still so hyper-focused on Russia? Well, in this interview, Tucker asks Putin that question. Why do you think, he says, the United States is still so anti-Russia? Why has each U.S. president that promised during their elections to renew U.S.-Russia relations, but then mysteriously dropped that idea once getting sworn in? Watch his response.
But you're describing two different systems. You say the leader acts in the interest of the voters, but you also say these decisions are not made by the leader, they're made by the ruling classes. You've run this country for so long, you've known all these American presidents. What are those power centers in the United States, do you think? Like, who actually makes the decisions?
I don't know. America is a complex country, conservative on one hand, rapidly changing on the other. It's not easy for us to sort it all out. Who makes decisions in the elections? Is it possible to understand this when each state has its own legislation? Each state regulates itself? Someone can be excluded from elections at the state level. It is a two-stage electoral system. It is very difficult for us to understand it. Certainly, there are two parties that are dominant, the Republicans and the Democrats. And within this party system, the centers that make decisions, that prepare decisions. Then, look, why, in my opinion, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, such an erroneous, crude, completely unjustified policy of pressure was pursued against Russia? After all, this is a policy of pressure. NATO expansion, support for the separatists in Caucasus, creation of a missile defense system. These are all elements of pressure. Pressure, pressure, pressure. Then, dragging Ukraine into NATO is all about pressure, pressure, pressure. Why? I think, among other things, because excessive production capacities were created. During the confrontation with the Soviet Union, there were many centers created and specialists on the Soviet Union who could not do anything else. They convinced the political leadership that it is necessary to continue chiseling Russia, to try to break it up, to create on this territory several quasi-state entities, and to subdue them in a divided form, to use their combined potential for the future struggle with China. This is a mistake, including the excessive potential of those who worked for the confrontation with the Soviet Union. It is necessary to get rid of this. There should be new, fresh forces, people who look into the future and understand what is happening in the world. Look at how Indonesia is developing. 600 million people. Where can we get away from that? Nowhere. We just have to assume that Indonesia will enter. It is already in the club of the world's leading economies, no matter who likes it or dislikes it.
So that's the first item that I personally found very interesting. He says the goal isn't to overthrow Russia and prop up a new pro-Western leader like we did in Ukraine, like we usually would do. Instead, it's to break Russia into these micro-states, which would make sense. Russia's huge, easier to control that way, easier to overthrow if you have to, all in the goal, though, of defeating China. Now, the second item that I want to highlight from the interview is even more important. It's about the self-destruction of the United States, something that you may think sounds crazy, but it's not. We've been talking about it since starting the channel 18 months ago, and hearing Putin sit across from Tucker Carlson. Whatever you think about Tucker, he's an American, so put your political ideology aside for a minute and really think about this. Vladimir Putin, sitting across from an American citizen and smirking and smiling over watching the United States self-implode. How he doesn't have to do anything, he says. We're doing it all to ourselves. During the interview, Tucker asks about BRICS. That's how this exchange got started. But the discussion around this is so much larger than just BRICS. He describes the coming downfall of the United States, how that will happen, how we're doing it to ourselves with the weaponization of the dollar. Which, if you're not familiar with this topic, just quickly, the reason the US is so powerful is because of the dollar. The way things played out after World War II, whether it was all deliberate, carefully crafted by some very smart people in Washington back then, or if we just got super lucky, there's different takes on that. But whatever the reason is, however all that happened, the point is we are where we are, right? In a remarkable place, in a remarkable stroke of luck, our country controls the world reserve currency. The dollar is the source of the US power. And rewind pre-Ukraine war in 2020, for instance, the vast majority of global trade was settled with the dollar. That gives us major leverage and political strength. It's allowed us to spend out the wazoo, for instance, currently sitting on top of $34+ trillion in debt. The only reason we don't have Argentina level inflation right now is because of the dollar, because all other countries need to settle their trade deals in dollars. It allows us to export our inflation abroad, helping to maintain and moderate inflation here at home. But the moment that stops being the case, the moment other countries decide and they realize, hey, why don't we just use our own local currencies to settle transactions? Why are we using the dollar? When that happens, when that time comes, and the usage of the dollar collapses, we're screwed. So why then? Why would US leadership ever do something to cause that to happen? Why act so reckless with this power? With great power comes great responsibility, right? We could keep talking about this for like an hour. There's so much more to it, how China's yuan is rising and this new BRICS currency is in the works. But instead, I'll play the clip for you so you can hear for yourself Putin smirk and smile while explaining how Russia doesn't have to lift a finger to watch America destroy itself. How once the dollar loses its reserve currency status, our debt is going to do the rest, collapse on top of us, basically. Watch this.
Well, let's just give one example, the US dollar, which has kind of united the world in a lot of ways, maybe not to your advantage, but certainly to ours. Is that going away as the reserve currency, the universally accepted currency? How have sanctions, do you think, changed the dollar's place in the world?
You know, to use the dollar as a tool of foreign policy struggle is one of the biggest strategic mistakes made by the US political leadership. The dollar is the cornerstone of the United States power. I think everyone understands very well that no matter how many dollars are printed, they are quickly dispersed all over the world. Inflation in the United States is minimal. It's about 3 or 3.4%, which is, I think, totally acceptable for the US. But they won't stop printing. What does the debt of $33 trillion tell us about? It is about the emission. Nevertheless, it is the main weapon used by the United States to preserve its power across the world. As soon as the political leadership decided to use the US dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power. I would not like to use any strong language, but it is a stupid thing to do and a grave mistake. Look at what is going on in the world. Even the United States allies are now downsizing their dollar reserves. Seeing this, everyone starts looking for ways to protect themselves. But the fact that the United States applies restrictive measures to certain countries, such as placing restrictions on transactions, freezing assets, etc., causes grave concern and sends a signal to the whole world. What did we have here? Until 2022, about 80% of Russian foreign trade transactions were made in US dollars and euros.
80% в наших расчетах с третьими странами. 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 80% в наших рас
US dollars accounted for approximately 50% of our transactions with third countries, while currently it is down to 13%. It wasn't us who banned the use of the US dollar. We had no such intention. It was decision of the United States to restrict our transactions in US dollars. I think it is complete foolishness from the point of view of the interests of the United States itself and its taxpayers, as it damages the US economy, undermines the power of the United States across the world. By the way, our transactions in yuan accounted for about 3%. Today, 34% of our transactions are made in rubles, and about as much, a little over 34% in yuan. Why did the United States do this? My only guess is self-conceit. They probably thought it would lead to full collapse, but nothing collapsed. Moreover, other countries, including oil producers, are thinking of and already accepting payments for oil in yuan. Do you even realize what is going on or not? Does anyone in the United States realize this? What are you doing? You are cutting yourself off. All experts say this. Ask any intelligent and thinking person in the United States what the dollar means for the US.
But
You're killing it with your own hands.
I think that's I think that's a fair assessment. The question is what comes next, and maybe you trade one colonial power for another, much less sentimental and forgiving colonial power. I mean, is the BRICS, for example, in danger of being completely dominated by the Chinese economy?
All right, that wraps up this episode. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Also, don't forget to check out our new daily show over on the Notify America YouTube channel. The link's in the description.